It was supposed to be a dream trip, a much-needed escape from our regular lives. My wife Sarah and I had planned this RV road trip for months. I'd spent countless nights poring over maps and blogs, looking for the most picturesque places to visit, the most serene spots to camp. Sarah had been just as excited, preparing the RV with all the essentials: snacks, blankets, even a stack of books we never seemed to have time to read. We weren't the adventurous type, really. We weren't into backcountry hikes or extreme sports, but we loved the idea of being surrounded by nature without giving up the comforts of a cozy bed, a stove, and a warm shower. So the RV was perfect. It was our little moving home, and it felt safe. The trip started normally enough. We visited a few well-known campsites, saw some beautiful places, and met a few friendly fellow campers. But after a week or so on the road, we wanted something more remote. Somewhere quieter, away from the crowds. That's how we found Black Hollow Campground. I don't remember exactly how we stumbled across it. We were driving through a heavily wooded area, miles from any town, when Sarah spotted a faded wooden sign barely visible through the trees. It simply said, Black Hollow, 3 miles. It wasn't on any of the maps we had, and there were no online reviews or pictures. Maybe that should have been the first red flag, but we were intrigued. A secluded spot sounded perfect. We turned down the dirt road and headed deeper into the forest. After a few minutes of bouncing along the unpaved path, the trees began to thin, and we found ourselves at the edge of a small clearing. There were a few other RVs parked in neat rows around the perimeter of the campground. The place was quiet, peaceful even, and surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the late afternoon sun. It was perfect. We picked a spot near the center. We decided to walk around, thinking maybe there was a reason everyone had cleared out. Maybe there was a weather warning or something we missed. But when I checked my phone, I had no signal. Sarah's phone was dead too. We tried the small radio we had in the RV, but all we got was static. Let's just pack up and leave, Sarah suggested, her nervousness growing by the minute. But as I went to turn the key in the ignition, a chill ran down my spine. The engine wouldn't start. It had been working fine the entire trip, but now it was completely dead. We were stuck. For the rest of the day, we tried to keep ourselves busy, thinking maybe someone would show up or we'd figure out what was wrong with the RV. But the longer we stayed, the more unsettling things became. Around noon, I noticed something strange on one of the windows. At first, I thought it was dirt or maybe a smudge, but when I got closer, I realized it was some sort of symbol. It looked like a crude, spiraling pattern scratched into the glass. I called Sarah over and we checked the other windows. The symbols were on all of them. Every single window had a similar pattern etched into it, as if someone or something had been around the RV in the night while we slept. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, that maybe the other campers had done it before leaving, but the symbols, they felt ancient, like something you'd see in a cave painting or a witch's spellbook. We wiped them off, but they reappeared later that evening, more prominent than before. That night, things got worse. It was well past midnight, and we were both lying in bed, wide awake. The oppressive silence from earlier had returned, and the air inside the RV felt heavy. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made us jump. And then we heard it. A knock. Faint at first, like someone gently tapping on the door. We both froze. I whispered to Sarah, "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The knocking came again, louder this time. It wasn't frantic or rushed, just a steady, deliberate sound. We didn't dare move. I don't know why, but something inside me screamed not to open the door, not to even look outside. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, then finally stopped. But the dread didn't leave. We lay there, too scared to even breathe, waiting for something, anything to happen. Morning finally came, and with it, a thin layer of fog had settled over the campground. The symbols were back, more detailed this time. By the third night, we were both exhausted. I wasn't sure how much longer we could take it. As we lay there, waiting for the inevitable knocking, Sarah whispered, "Maybe we should open the door. Maybe it's someone trying to help us." But something deep inside me knew better. Whatever was knocking wasn't there to help. It didn't want us to leave, it wanted us to stay. The knocking started again, louder than ever, but this time there was something else. A scraping sound, like nails dragging along the side of the RV. The whole vehicle shook, and for the first time we heard a voice. A low, guttural whisper, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded ancient, primal. The words seemed to seep through the walls, vibrating in my bones. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we both sat there, paralyzed with fear. The knocking grew more frantic, the whispering more urgent, but we didn't move. We didn't dare. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The knocking, the whispering, the shaking, it all just stopped. When the sun rose the next morning, the RV started on the first try. We didn't question it. We didn't look back. We just drove as fast as we could until we were miles away from Black Hollow. We never spoke about it again. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I swear I still hear that faint, steady knocking. And I know, whatever it was, it's still out there. Just when they thought they were safe, the shadows seemed to grow darker. I still think about that trip sometimes. It's been years now, but there are moments, usually when I'm lying in bed and the house is too quiet, when I can almost hear those footsteps again. I try to tell myself it didn't happen, that we all imagined it. But deep down, I know that's a lie. Something happened to us out there, something none of us will ever really understand. It started out like any other road trip. There were 5 of us, me, my girlfriend, Lily, and our friends, Tom, Jess, and Mark. We'd been talking about doing an RV trip for ages, and we finally decided to go for it. We rented a decent-sized RV, packed it full of food and drinks, and hit the road. The plan was simple. Drive, find a few campgrounds, chill by the fire, and just get away from everything for a week or 2. The first few days were great. We drove through small towns, stopped at a couple of nice spots to camp, and spent our nights laughing around the fire, roasting marshmallows, and swapping dumb stories. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere with your friends that makes everything feel easy, like the rest of the world doesn't exist. But then we picked up the hitchhiker. It was on the 4th day of our trip. We were driving through some back roads in the middle of nowhere, miles from the last town we'd passed. The trees were thick on both sides of the road, towering over us, and the sky was starting to turn that soft orange of late afternoon. That's when we saw him. A guy standing on the side of the road, his thumb out. I'll admit, I wasn't thrilled about picking up a stranger. None of us really were, except for Tom, who thought it'd be an adventure. That's what he always said, like every risky idea was just another adventure waiting to happen. The guy didn't look dangerous or anything. He was probably in his mid-40s, wearing a flannel shirt and old jeans with a big backpack slung over one shoulder. His face was weathered, like someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors, but he didn't seem crazy or anything. Just tired. And when you're driving through the middle of nowhere, you can't help but feel a little sorry for someone stranded out there. Tom pulled over before any of us could really argue, and the guy climbed in. He sat up front next to Tom, thanked us, and introduced himself as Caleb. Said he'd been out hiking and needed a ride to the next town. He seemed normal enough at first, making small talk about the weather and how we were lucky to have picked a good week for camping. But then, out of nowhere, he asked us, "You guys planning on camping in Black Pines?" I'd never heard of it, and by the looks on everyone else's faces, neither had they. Tom, of course, was curious. "Where's that?" he asked. Caleb pointed up ahead. "About an hour up the road. It's a big forest, real secluded. Some folks say it's cursed." That got our attention. "Cursed?" Mark laughed. "Come on, man. What, like haunted?" Caleb didn't laugh. He just looked out the window for a second before answering. "People go missing out there, always have. Hunters, hikers, campers, even people who live nearby avoid it. Say there's something in the woods that takes them." The RV went quiet for a minute. I don't know if it was the way Caleb said it, or just the fact that we were out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees, but suddenly it didn't seem so funny anymore. Lily spoke up. "You mean, like animals, bears or something?" Caleb shook his head. "No, not animals. There's something else out there. Something that watches you, follows you. You'll hear it at night, walking around your camp, but when you look, there's nothing there. And in the morning, there'll be these handprints on your tent or your car. Only they're too small to be human." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him it was just a story, but something about the way he spoke, he wasn't trying to scare us. He was just telling us what he knew. Tom, of course, was all in. Dude, that sounds— What? It's just a story, he said, grinning. Come on, we've been driving for days, let's do something exciting for once. I could tell Jess wasn't too keen on the idea either, but she didn't say anything. Caleb just shrugged. You can do what you want, he said, but I wouldn't go there. Not at night, anyway. We dropped Caleb off in the next town, and by then I was sure we'd forget about the whole thing. But Tom wouldn't let it go. The guy loved a thrill, and the idea of camping in a cursed forest was too good for him to pass up. After some arguing, he convinced us to at least check it out. I wish we hadn't. We found black pines, just like Caleb said, about an hour up the road. There wasn't an official campground or anything, just a bunch of trees and an old dirt road that led deeper into the woods. It was already getting dark when we pulled in, but Tom was determined, so we parked the RV and set up camp right there on the side of the road. That first night was unsettling. I don't know if it was the fact that we knew the story or if there was something else going on, but none of us could really relax. We sat around the fire, trying to keep things light, but every little sound from the woods made us jump. At some point, we all just gave up and went to bed, too tired to care anymore. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought maybe one of the others had gotten up to use the bathroom, but then I realized the steps were coming from outside the RV. They were soft, like someone was walking barefoot, and they circled around the RV slowly, almost cautiously. I held my breath, listening, too scared to move. The footsteps continued, making their way all the way around the RV before stopping at the door. There was a long pause, and then, slowly, the steps moved away, disappearing into the woods. The next morning, I didn't say anything. I figured I must have imagined it, that maybe it was an animal or something. But when Lily and Jess saw the windows, they freaked out. There were handprints on the glass, dozens of them, smeared all over the windows. But they weren't human. The fingers were too long, too thin, and the prints were small, like the hands of a child. Only not. Tom tried to play it off as a prank, said maybe someone had come by in the night to mess with us. But there was no way. We were miles from anywhere, and we would have heard someone walking up to the RV. We argued about whether to stay or go, but Tom insisted we stay, at least for one more night. He thought it was just some local kids messing around, and he didn't want to back down. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, we all heard them. They started just after midnight, soft and slow, circling the RV again. None of us moved. We just sat there staring at each other, wide-eyed and terrified. The steps stopped by the door again, and then came the tapping. Light, like someone drumming their fingers against the door, testing it. Tom was the first to speak. "It's just an animal," he whispered, but he didn't sound so sure anymore. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, and then, just like the night before, the steps slowly faded away into the trees. The next morning, the handprints were back, more of them this time, covering every window. We were all freaked out, even Tom. None of us wanted to stay, but we were too scared to even step outside to pack up. We spent the whole day huddled in the RV, waiting for something to happen. Every now and then, we'd hear rustling in the trees or a snap of a branch, but nothing came close. It wasn't until the sun started to set that we finally got the nerve to move. We packed up as fast as we could and got out of there. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back on the main road, and even then, we didn't feel safe. We never talked about it after that trip. We just went home and pretended it never happened. But sometimes when I'm alone, I'll hear footsteps outside, soft and slow, circling around, and I'll wonder if whatever was in those woods followed us home, and if one night I'll wake up to find those handprints on my window again. But the quiet didn't last long. Something was coming. It all started as a getaway. Just me, my wife, Laura, and the RV we rented for a week-long trip in the mountains. We weren't doing anything crazy, just looking for some peace and quiet. The idea was to drive out to this old mountain town we'd heard about, set up camp in the valley nearby, and just unplug for a few days. We're not hardcore campers or anything, but the RV made it easy. It was our home away from home, with all the basics: a little kitchen, a bed, and most importantly, a TV to unwind at night. The first couple of days were perfect. The weather was good, the scenery was beautiful, and we spent most of our time hiking, grilling, and sitting around the campfire. At night, we'd settle in, flip on the TV, and watch whatever we could pick up with the small antenna attached to the roof of the RV. There wasn't much in terms of reception, but we didn't mind. The static-filled channels were good enough to kill a couple of hours before bed. But on the third night, something changed. We'd spent the evening sitting outside, watching the stars, and by the time we went back inside the RV, it was pitch black out. Laura flicked on the TV, and it was nothing but static. At first, we didn't think much of it. It wasn't like we were expecting HD channels out here. But then, through the static, I thought I saw something. Just for a second, a shadow, or maybe a figure, flickering in and out. Laura glanced at the screen, squinting. "See what?" I stared harder, but there was nothing now, just the usual fuzz of the static. "Never mind. I thought I saw something." She shrugged, clearly not interested, and went back to flipping through the few channels we had. All of them were the same, static. That's when the first whisper came. It was faint, so faint that at first I wasn't sure I'd heard anything. But then it came again, a little louder this time. My name. "Jake." I froze. Laura didn't seem to notice. I turned to her. "Did you hear that?" She looked at me, confused. "Hear what?" "My name." "I swear I just heard someone say my name." She laughed. "You're hearing things. There's no one out here." I wasn't so sure. The sound was so clear, like someone was standing just outside the RV, whispering through the walls. But I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I let it go. The next day, everything felt normal again. We spent most of the day hiking around the valley, checking out the old mining town nearby. It was mostly abandoned, a few rundown buildings, and some locals selling trinkets to the rare tourists that passed through. We didn't stay long, and by the time we got back to the RV, it was getting dark again. That night, the static was worse. Every channel we turned to was completely filled with it, the screen almost blinding in its brightness. But this time, the figures were more noticeable. They weren't just flickers anymore. They were shapes moving through the static, shifting in and out of view. I could have sworn I saw a person standing there, looking straight at the screen, but as soon as I blinked, they were gone. Then came the whispers again. Only this time, it wasn't just my name. "Jake, Laura." Laura jumped. She heard it this time. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, I heard it." We both sat there, staring at the TV, waiting for the voices to come again. But they didn't. Just the static, filling the RV with that low, buzzing sound that seemed to get under your skin. "We should turn it off," Laura said, reaching for the remote. But I stopped her. "Wait, just wait." I don't know why I wanted to keep watching. Maybe I thought if we turned it off, we'd miss something important. Or maybe I was just too freaked out to look away. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the TV was picking up some weird signal, something from a nearby radio tower, or maybe a prank from the town. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something more to it, something that didn't make sense. We debated leaving, but part of me didn't want to. I wanted to figure out what was going on, to understand what we were seeing and hearing. So we stayed. Big mistake. That night, the static wasn't just on the TV. The radio, which we hadn't even touched, suddenly crackled to life, filling the RV with that same buzzing sound. And through the static, we could hear the whispers again. Louder this time. Closer. "Come outside. Now." Laura looked at me, terrified. "Jake, we need to go." I nodded, fumbling for the keys. But when I turned the ignition, nothing happened. The RV wouldn't start. I tried again, but the engine just sputtered, refusing to turn over. We were stuck. The whispers continued, growing more insistent. The figures in the static became clearer, more defined. They were people. No, things. Standing just outside the RV, their faces barely visible through the fuzz on the screen. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel them staring at us, waiting. "Come outside." We didn't. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the RV, refusing to open the door, refusing to look outside. The whispers kept coming. The static never stopped. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, it was morning, and everything was quiet. We left as soon as we could, the RV finally starting without any issues. We didn't talk much on the drive back home, but I knew Laura was just as freaked out as I was. Even now, back in the safety of our house, I can't shake the feeling that something followed us. Sometimes, when the TV is on late at night and the signal cuts out for a second, I swear I see those figures in the static. And every once in a while, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I hear it again. Come outside. But I never do. As they walked away, a cold feeling crept up their spine, like they were being watched. I didn't think anything of it when I took that exit. We were on our way back from a week-long RV trip, just me, my wife Emily, and our 2 kids, Charlie and Olivia. The trip had been fine, a little too much driving, but that's what you sign up for when you decide to take an RV across the country. The plan was to take the scenic route home, enjoy a bit more of the mountains before we had to deal with the reality of getting back to work and school. We'd been driving for hours that day, and I was tired. The kids were in the back, bickering over who got to watch what on the tablet, and Emily was dozing off in the passenger seat. We were somewhere in the middle of nowhere. That kind of stretch where the landscape just blurs into miles of flat, dry land, and the road never seems to end. Then I saw it, a small exit, barely marked, leading off the main highway. It wasn't on our map, but I figured it could cut some time off our drive. I'd never been one to trust GPS completely anyway, and I thought, why not take the back roads? Maybe it would be a little more scenic, maybe we'd come across a neat little town, or at least shave off some time from the seemingly endless highway. I wish I hadn't taken that turn. At first, the road seemed fine. Narrower, but well-paved, cutting through some dense woods. The kind of road where you pass by a house every 5 miles or so, but otherwise, it's just trees and sky. We drove for a while, and everything seemed normal. The kids fell asleep in the back, and Emily woke up and started reading a book. It was peaceful, actually, the kind of quiet you don't get on the interstate. Then, about an hour in, things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was that we hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. I mean, I wasn't expecting traffic or anything, but this was unusual. The second thing was the GPS. It just stopped. The little arrow that usually followed our route was stuck, showing we were off the grid as if we weren't even on a road anymore. I glanced at Emily. Hey, do you have signal? She pulled out her phone and frowned. Nope, nothing. That was weird. We'd had service up until a few minutes ago, even in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't too worried, though. We were probably just in a dead zone, and I figured the signal would come back soon. But it didn't. The road kept twisting and turning through the trees, and I started to get this sinking feeling in my gut. I checked the dashboard clock. We'd been on that road for over an hour now, and it felt like we were driving in circles. The trees all looked the same, the bends in the road felt repetitive, and I was starting to get this creeping sense of déjà vu. Emily must have noticed I was getting tense. "What's wrong?" she asked, glancing up from her book. "I don't know," I admitted. "Something's not right. We should have hit a town or something by now." She looked out the window, then at the GPS. "Maybe we missed a turn?" I nodded, trying to push down the unease building in my chest. "Yeah, maybe." I slowed down, looking for any kind of sign or landmark that could tell us where we were. But there was nothing. No road signs, no mile markers, not even a driveway leading off the road. Just trees. Endless trees. That's when I noticed something else. The light was fading, but it wasn't sunset yet. The sky was still pale, but everything around us seemed to be getting darker. The trees, the road, everything felt like it was dimming, as if someone was slowly turning down the brightness on the world. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There were shadows. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. Emily frowned, looking over her shoulder. "See what?" I glanced in the mirror again. The shadows were gone. "Never mind," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The road continued, and my nerves were on edge. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, grew stronger with every mile. I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't alone. Then the chanting started. At first it was faint, almost like the wind was carrying distant voices through the trees. But as we drove, it got louder. Low, rhythmic murmurs in a language I didn't recognize. I turned off the radio, thinking maybe it was picking up interference. But the chanting continued. Emily sat up straighter, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. "Yeah, The kids were still asleep, oblivious to the strange sounds filling the RV. I didn't want to scare them, but I didn't know what was happening either. My pulse quickened as I pressed down on the gas, trying to get us out of there. That's when I saw them again. The shadows. They were closer this time, almost keeping pace with the RV, flickering in and out of the trees on either side of the road. My hands were sweating, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. "Jake, we need to turn around," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." I didn't argue. I slammed on the brakes and tried to make a U-turn on the narrow road. The RV creaked as it turned, the tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel. But as soon as we were facing the other direction, my stomach dropped. It was the same road, the same trees, and now the shadows were in front of us. I pressed the gas hard, the RV lurching forward. The chanting grew louder, filling the air around us, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I drove faster, the RV bouncing over the rough patches of the road. But no matter how far we went, we were stuck. The road kept looping back on itself, leading us past the same stretch over and over again. The shadows, the chanting, the darkening trees. It all felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw it. A clearing, up ahead, with a narrow dirt path leading off the main road. It wasn't on the map, but it didn't matter anymore. I took it, hoping it would lead us out, but the moment we turned onto the path, the RV's engine sputtered and died. Silence. Emily's hand gripped mine, her face pale. The kids were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the horror outside. Then, through the stillness, we heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps circling the RV. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to see what was out there. I just sat there, holding my breath, praying it would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the door, and then a knock. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, methodical, as if whatever was out there knew we were inside. Waiting, Emily squeezed my hand tighter. "Jake," I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, my mind blank. All I could think was, we have to stay quiet. Don't open the door. Don't move. The knocking continued, patient and steady. Tap, tap. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the key, hoping against hope that the engine would start. But before I could turn it, the RV rocked, as if something heavy had slammed into it from the side. The kids woke up startled, their eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" Charlie asked, his voice shaky. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The RV rocked again, harder this time. The footsteps outside were louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I couldn't see anything through the windows, just shadows moving in the darkness. Then, without warning, the chanting stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever had been out there had finally left. But then, the voice came. Deep, raspy, and terrifyingly close. "Come out." It was a command, a demand. We didn't move. "Come out," the voice repeated, louder this time. I clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Emily was crying now, her face buried in her hands. The kids were huddled together in the back, too scared to make a sound. And then the door handle rattled. I jumped, my heart nearly stopping. The door was locked, but it didn't matter. Whatever was out there wanted in, and I wasn't sure how long the flimsy RV door would hold. For what felt like hours, we sat there, waiting, as the thing outside tried to get in. The shadows in the windows grew darker, more solid, and I could feel the air getting colder, thicker. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps, the growling, the voice, it all just stopped. I don't know how long we sat there in the silence, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. But eventually, the sun began to rise, and the light broke through the trees. I turned the key again, and this time, the engine roared to life. We didn't talk, we didn't look back, we just drove. Drove until we were back on the highway, back to civilization, back to safety. But I'll never forget that road, that detour that wasn't on any map. The shadows, the chanting, the thing that tried to get in. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I still hear it. Just when you thought the nightmare was over, it's only just begun. It all started as a simple camping trip. My friend Jake and I had planned this for weeks, a getaway from the city, just the two of us, parked by a secluded lake somewhere deep in the woods. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, just nature, and the peaceful sound of water lapping against the shore. We borrowed Jake's dad's RV, stocked it with everything we needed, and set off on a Friday afternoon, excited to spend the weekend far away from the noise of everyday life. When we arrived at the campsite, it was perfect. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the calm surface of the lake. We were the only ones there, or at least that's what it felt like. The nearest town was miles away, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the soft splash of water as fish jumped here and there. It was exactly what we wanted: peace, quiet, and isolation. We parked the RV close to the water, about 20 feet from the shoreline. After setting up a small fire pit and arranging a couple of lawn chairs outside, we cracked open a couple of beers and settled in for the night. The stars came out, brighter than I'd ever seen them. There was something about being out there, so far from civilization, that made everything seem clearer, crisper. It was almost too perfect. As the night wore on, we got tired, so we decided to call it a night and headed into the RV. Jake passed out almost instantly, but I wasn't quite ready to sleep. I stayed up, lying on the small bed by the window, staring out at the lake. The moonlight shimmered off the water, creating this eerie, silvery glow. Everything was still, and I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found such a perfect spot. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, almost like a whisper. I thought maybe it was the wind rustling through the trees, but there wasn't any wind. The night was dead calm. I sat up, listening harder. There it was again, a soft, unintelligible whisper, almost like someone was speaking just beneath the surface of the water. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination running wild in the quiet, but it didn't stop. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, but still so faint that I couldn't make out any words. It was strange, though. It didn't sound like one voice. It sounded like a few, maybe 2 or 3, all overlapping each other, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I got up, pressed my face against the window, and stared out at the lake. Nothing. Just the water, as still as ever, glimmering under the moonlight. I convinced myself it was the sound of the water, or maybe some animals nearby, and eventually managed to fall asleep. The next day was uneventful. We spent the afternoon fishing, swimming, and just relaxing by the lake. I didn't mention the whispers to Jake. It seemed too silly. I didn't want him to think I was freaking out over nothing. But as night fell again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lake, which had seemed so peaceful and inviting during the day, now felt different, darker, more ominous. We sat around the fire for a while, talking and joking like we always did, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, back at the water. It felt like something was watching us. I couldn't explain it, but there was this constant prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like eyes were on me. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I told Jake I was heading inside early. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring out at the lake again. And just like the night before, the whispers started. Only this time, they were louder. Clearer. They were still too faint for me to make out any actual words, but I could hear them, unmistakably coming from the direction of the water. I tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop. It was like they were calling to me, urging me to come closer, to step outside and walk toward the lake. I didn't. I stayed in bed, my heart racing, every muscle in my body tense. After what felt like hours, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to Jake shaking my shoulder. "Dude, wake up," he whispered, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" I sat up, still groggy, but the moment I listened, I heard it. The whispers were back, louder than ever, and this time they weren't just whispers. They were mixed with something else, soft splashing sounds, like someone, or something, was moving through the water. Jake and I exchanged a look. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jake muttered, "but it's been going on for a while now. I thought it was you messing with me." "No, I've been in here the whole time." We both got up and walked to the window. The moon was still bright, casting an eerie glow over the lake, but now, just beneath the surface of the water, we could see movement. Ripples. Small waves, as if something was swimming just beneath the surface. And then we saw them. Faces. Pale, ghostly faces, just barely visible beneath the water, staring up at us with hollow, dark eyes. There were 3 of them, their mouths moving, whispering in that same unintelligible language. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, pulling Jake with me. "What the hell are those things?" I gasped. "I don't know, man, but we need to get out of here." We scrambled to grab our things, but just as we were about to bolt for the driver's seat, the RV shook. It was like something had slammed into the side of it, hard enough to make the whole vehicle rock. The whispers were louder now, more frantic, almost angry. Jake cursed under his breath, fumbling with the keys. The RV shook again, and this time I heard the unmistakable sound of water splashing against the side of the vehicle. Whatever was out there was getting closer. Finally, Jake got the engine started, and we peeled out of there, driving as fast as we could down the dirt road, away from the lake. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back on the main highway. Neither of us said a word for the longest time. We were both too shaken to speak. Eventually, Jake broke the silence. "What the hell just happened back there?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I'm never going back to that lake." We made it home without any further incidents, but the whole drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something far worse than we could comprehend. When we got back, we told a few friends about what happened, but no one believed us. They laughed it off, said we'd probably just had too much to drink or let our imaginations run wild. But here's the thing. When we went back to get the rest of our stuff the next morning, the campsite was empty. There were no tire marks from the RV, no sign that we'd ever been there. The fire pit we'd built? Gone. The chairs? Gone. It was like we'd never been there at all. To this day, I still don't know what we saw or what was really out there in that lake. All I know is that I'll never go camping by a lake again. But if you think that was terrifying, wait until you hear the next tale. I'll be the first to admit that I never really believed in ghost stories or urban legends. You know, the type of spooky tales your uncle tells you around the campfire, hoping to give you nightmares. My wife Sarah used to tease me about it, calling me the skeptic, always brushing off the idea that something supernatural could exist. But now, sitting here, trying to make sense of what happened that night in the desert, I'm not so sure anymore. In fact, I wish I hadn't been so quick to ignore the warning we were given. It all started innocently enough, as most of these things do. Sarah and I had been planning our RV trip through the desert for months. We wanted to get away from the bustle of the city, just the two of us and the open road. We'd always enjoyed the peace and quiet of camping, the kind that came with nothing but the wind whistling through the desert, the stars hanging so low you felt like you could touch them. We were about halfway through our trip, winding our way through the endless dry landscape of the desert. When it happened, our RV sputtered, the engine giving a sickening cough before it just stopped, dead. There wasn't a town in sight, just miles and miles of sand, rocks, and barren hills. We had no cell signal out there, not a single bar. "Maybe it's just overheated," I said, more to reassure myself than Sarah. She gave me a tight smile, clearly trying to stay calm. "You can fix it, right?" Now, I'm not completely useless when it comes to engines, but I'm no mechanic either. I tried everything I could think of, checking the fluids, messing with the spark plugs, but nothing worked. We were well and truly stuck. Just as we were starting to think we'd be spending the night stranded out there, we saw the dust cloud. An old, beat-up truck came rumbling down the road, kicking up sand behind it. It was a rusted-out thing, the kind of vehicle that looks like it belongs in a junkyard. The driver pulled up beside us, an older guy with a face weathered by the sun. He looked like he'd been living in the desert for years, maybe even born out here. His eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "You folks need help?" he called out, voice gravelly. Relief washed over me. "Yeah, the RV just died on us. Do you know anything about engines?" The man didn't say much, just nodded and climbed out of his truck. He popped the hood of our RV and started tinkering with the engine, his hands moving with a kind of practiced ease. The whole time, Sarah and I exchanged nervous glances, a little uncomfortable with how quiet he was. But we were desperate, and we didn't have much choice. After what felt like an eternity, the old man wiped his hands on a rag and slammed the hood shut. "She's good to go now," he said. I couldn't believe it. "Just like that? How much do we owe you?" He shook his head. "No charge." That should have been a red flag. No mechanic out in the middle of nowhere fixes an RV for free. But before I could question him, he gave us a strange look, one I'd later replay over and over in my mind. "If you're smart, you won't camp in the canyon up ahead," he said, pointing off toward the hills in the distance. "Stay clear of it tonight." I frowned. Why? What's wrong with the canyon? The man didn't answer right away. He just turned and climbed back into his truck, leaving me standing there, more confused than before. "Just don't," he muttered before driving off, his truck disappearing into the desert as quickly as it had come. Now, any reasonable person would have heeded the warning, but we weren't reasonable that day. Sarah and I had driven for hours, and the idea of driving further into the night didn't appeal to us. Plus, the canyon sounded like a great place to camp, secluded, scenic. We convinced ourselves the old man was just some superstitious local, and we headed straight for it. We arrived at the canyon just before sunset. It was beautiful in a stark, desolate kind of way. The walls of the canyon loomed around us, casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower in the sky. We set up camp, pulled out our chairs, and made a simple dinner. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. But as the night wore on, something shifted. At first it was just a feeling, an uneasiness that crept up on me as the light faded. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon like some kind of distant wail. I tried to brush it off, but then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a soft clink, like metal tapping against metal. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it kept happening, rhythmic, steady. "Do you hear that?" I asked Sarah. She nodded, her eyes wide. "It's probably just the wind," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. The sound got louder. Clink, clink, clink. Like someone was tapping a wrench against metal over and over again. It echoed off the canyon walls surrounding us. My heart started to race. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, and then we saw it. A figure, standing on the ridge above us, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, thin, and just standing there, watching. The clinking noise kept going, almost like it was coming from the figure itself. My stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't a person, at least not in any way I could explain. The silhouette moved slowly, methodically, like it was searching for something. Or someone. "We should go," I whispered to Sarah, not taking my eyes off the figure. But we were trapped. The RV was parked against the canyon wall, and our only way out was toward that thing. We sat there, frozen, waiting for it to move, to leave, to do something. But it just stood there, watching us. The clinking grew louder, almost unbearable now, echoing through my skull. I don't know how long we sat there, but it felt like hours. Finally, the figure turned and slowly disappeared into the darkness, but the clinking didn't stop. It continued, surrounding us, relentless. We didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, clink, 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 growing louder and louder, like it was right outside the RV. Sarah and I didn't say a word, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left that canyon as fast as we could. We didn't speak about what happened, didn't need to. The terror in each other's eyes said enough. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if it was a person or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I should have listened to the old man. Some places aren't meant to be camped in. Some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed, and some warnings should never be ignored. The shadows grow darker with each story, and this one will make your heart race faster. I've always loved camping. There's something about the fresh air, the isolation, and the quiet that helps me reset. My favorite trips are usually at national parks where you can set up a campfire, sit around with friends, and tell stories deep into the night. I've done it for years. Nothing out of the ordinary ever. It started as a normal trip. My wife Sarah and I decided to take a long weekend with two of our closest friends, Mike and Jess. We all had RVs, and this time we planned to stay at a national park about 3 hours from our place. It was one of those parks that didn't get a lot of foot traffic, which was exactly why we chose it. We wanted some peace, some quiet, just us, the trees, and the stars. We arrived around noon on a Friday. The campground was nearly empty, which wasn't surprising, considering it was late in the season. The weather was crisp but not too cold, perfect for campfires and cozy nights in the RV. We parked our RVs side by side in a secluded spot near the back of the campground, surrounded by tall pines. There was only one other RV in sight, about 100 yards away, nestled under a canopy of trees. It looked older, maybe from the 80s or early 90s. It was in decent shape but had that worn, well-traveled look, like it had seen better days. "Looks like we've got a neighbor," Mike said, nodding towards the distant RV. "At least it's just one," I joked, figuring that some solitude would make the weekend feel even more special. We set up camp, lit a fire, and spent the first night laughing, grilling, and just enjoying the escape from reality. Around 10 p.m., we all decided to call it a night. The fire was burning down, and the woods were pitch black. As we were heading to bed, I noticed something odd. The lights in the other RV were flickering. At first, I thought it might just be the bulbs going out, but it wasn't that. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was turning them on and off deliberately. The weird thing was, we hadn't seen anyone near the RV all day. No one stepped outside to stretch their legs, no smoke from a campfire, nothing. "Do you think someone's in there?" Sarah asked, noticing me staring. "Probably just a loner, staying to themselves," I shrugged. "We'll see them in the morning, I'm sure." But the next morning came, and there was no sign of life from the RV. No movement, no noise, no nothing. I walked over to get a better look, figuring maybe the person inside just wasn't an early riser. The RV was old, with dust clinging to the windows. It looked like it hadn't been moved in months, maybe years. The tires were a bit sunken into the dirt, but it wasn't abandoned. Someone was definitely staying in there. You could feel it, that sense that someone was nearby, just out of sight. I decided not to dwell on it. We were there to relax, not to play detective. The day went by without a hitch. We hiked, had lunch by the lake, and laughed around the fire again that evening. But that night, the flickering lights returned. This time, though, there was something else. At around midnight, as we sat in our RV getting ready for bed, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the woods behind us. They were faint at first, almost like an animal, but they grew louder, like someone was pacing just outside our campsite. I peered out the window, but saw nothing, just the trees swaying in the night breeze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "Yeah," I said. "Maybe it's a deer or something." But deep down, I wasn't convinced. It sounded too deliberate, too human. The next day, we all shared our weird experiences. Mike and Jess had heard footsteps too, but none of us saw anything. I mentioned the flickering lights in the neighbor's RV, and Mike raised an eyebrow. "You sure there's someone in there? Because I haven't seen anyone," he said. "Yeah, I'm sure," I replied, though I didn't sound as confident as I wanted to. That afternoon, curiosity got the best of me. I walked over to the other RV, determined to say hello, to just make sure there was a real person in there. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I leaned in closer to the door, my ear almost pressed against it. That's when I heard something. It was faint, barely there, but I could swear I heard breathing. Shallow, slow breathing, as if someone was standing just on the other side of the door, not moving, not saying a word. Chills ran down my spine, and I backed away. My hand hovered near the doorknob, but something told me not to open it. Something about the situation felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be. That night, the flickering lights returned, but this time, they weren't just in the other RV. Our RV lights started flickering too. One minute, the interior lights were fine. The next, they were dimming, buzzing, as if something was messing with the power. Sarah looked at me, wide-eyed. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I said, trying to stay calm. "Maybe it's just an electrical issue." But I didn't believe that, and I don't think she did either. Then around 2 a.m., I saw something I'll never forget. I couldn't sleep, so I was lying there, staring out the small window in our RV that faced the neighbor's vehicle. The lights were still flickering, but this time, I saw a shadow, a figure moving behind the curtains. It was unmistakable, the silhouette of a person pacing back and forth. I sat up, squinting to get a better look. The figure stopped moving, standing still behind the curtains for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a single, slow movement, it turned, as if looking directly at me through the window. My heart stopped. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was in there could see me, even though the curtains were drawn. I shook Sarah awake. "There's someone in that RV," I whispered. She rubbed her eyes, groggy, and looked out the window. I don't see anything, but I did. The next morning, I told Mike and Jess what I saw. Mike wasn't having any of it. You're just spooked, he said, laughing it off. Maybe it's just some old guy living in there minding his own business. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps, the flickering lights, the figure in the window. It was all too much to ignore. On our last night, we decided to confront whoever was in that RV. We figured maybe it was just some creepy guy who didn't like company, but we wanted answers. Mike, being the bravest of us, marched right up to the RV door and knocked. Jess and I stood a few feet back, holding our breath. There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time, and the door creaked open slightly, as if it hadn't been latched properly. "Hello?" Mike called out. Silence. He pushed the door open all the way, and that's when we saw it. The inside of the RV was coated in dust. Thick layers of it covered everything. The counters, the seats, the floor. It looked like no one had been in there for years. But that wasn't the worst part. On the table, near the front window, was a single, half-burnt candle. It was the only thing that wasn't covered in dust. The wick was still smoldering, as if someone had just blown it out. We didn't say a word. We backed out of the RV, closed the door, and left. That night, none of us slept. We stayed up in our RVs, listening to every creak, every rustle in the woods. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no flickering lights, no shadows. The next morning, we packed up and left without a word. As we drove away, I glanced back at the old RV one last time. The curtains were open now, and I could see inside. It was empty. Completely empty. But then, just as we turned a corner, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing in the window, watching us leave. I don't know what we experienced out there, and I don't want to know. But one thing's for sure. I'll never go camping in that park again. And if you ever see an old, dusty RV with flickering lights, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Because some things are better left unexplained. As one horror fades, another rises from the depths. Brace yourself for what comes next. I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories. My wife Sarah and I love the outdoors, and with our 2 kids, Emily and Jake, we spent a lot of weekends camping. This time, though, we thought we'd try something different and rented an RV. No tents, no ground tarps, no waking up in the middle of the night on a rock. Just the comfort of a mobile home, parked somewhere peaceful. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a quiet escape from the usual city noise. Sarah had found a spot online, a remote RV park deep in the woods, perfect for families wanting a quiet getaway. When we arrived, though, the first odd thing was that there was no one else around. The online listing had advertised it as a popular hidden gem, but the place looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. The metal gate at the entrance hung off its hinges, weeds growing thickly around it. Rows of RVs sat scattered around the park, covered in rust and grime. Grass had grown over the wheels of some, and others looked like they hadn't moved in decades. It was eerie, but the park was free, and I figured that maybe it just wasn't as popular anymore. Sarah and I exchanged glances, but neither of us said anything. "Are we really staying here?" Emily, who was 13, asked, scrunching up her nose. "It'll be fine," I said, trying to sound convincing. "It's just a little overgrown." Jake, my 8-year-old, didn't seem to care. He was already poking around the rusting RVs, fascinated by the cobwebs and abandoned stuff he could see through the windows. We parked our own RV near the center of the park, next to what looked like the old camp office. The office was closed, windows smeared with dirt, but there were still faded signs advertising park rules and activities. There was a weird stillness in the air. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel. That night, after we'd settled in, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. We had dinner, the kids played a board game, and Sarah and I chatted about how weird the park was. But as the sun started to set, the silence got thicker. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the forest around us was holding its breath. Then came the hum. It was faint at first, like the distant sound of an engine starting up. I thought it was just our RV making some weird noise, but when I checked, everything seemed fine. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Probably just some old RV cooling down or something." But the hum didn't stop. It was getting louder, coming from somewhere outside. I stepped out of our RV, and that's when I noticed the lights. The RVs that had been dead and silent when we arrived were now flickering. One by one, pale yellow lights flickered on inside them, glowing weakly through the grime-covered windows. I could hear the faint crackle of old radios tuning in, and the hum of engines like they were trying to start but couldn't quite turn over. My heart raced. None of those RVs had looked functional. They were rusted, the windows cracked or missing, and the tires flat. There was no way anyone had been inside them. I quickly stepped back inside and locked the door behind me. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep calm for the kids' sake. "Just the RVs. The lights, I don't know." The kids were already looking out the window, watching the lights flicker on in the other RVs. "Are there people in those?" Emily asked, her voice small. "No," I said quickly. "No, there's no one. We're the only ones here." Jake pointed out the window. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Shadows. They were faint, barely visible, but inside some of the RVs I could see movement. Shapes, dark figures moving slowly past the windows. I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light or the old glass playing tricks on my eyes. But no, they were there, shifting and swaying, like they were walking around inside. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. "We're leaving," I said. Sarah nodded, pale. "Yes, right now." I grabbed the keys and tried to start our RV. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died. I tried again and again, but nothing. It was like the battery was drained, but it had been fine all day. I cursed under my breath and turned to Sarah. "We're stuck." "What do you mean we're stuck?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I mean the RV won't start." Emily and Jake were huddled on the couch, wide-eyed, watching us. The hum outside grew louder, and I could hear something else now. Voices, faint and muffled, like people talking, but too far away to understand. "We need to stay inside," I said, trying to sound calm. "Lock the doors, close the windows. We'll figure it out in the morning." We spent the rest of the night sitting in silence, the four of us huddled together on the couch. The lights in the other RVs flickered on and off, shadows continuing to move inside them. The voices never got any clearer, but they were there. A constant murmur just outside, just beyond reach. Eventually the lights in the other RVs went out, one by one, until the park was dark again. The humming stopped. The shadows disappeared, but our RV still wouldn't start. At dawn, we finally stepped outside, exhausted and shaken. The park was silent again, just as it had been when we arrived. There were no signs of anyone else, no footsteps, no tracks. The RVs were just as rusted and abandoned as before, as if nothing had happened. We left the park that morning, hitchhiking to the nearest town for help. No one believed our story, of course. The mechanic who towed our RV back said the battery had been fine, just completely drained for no apparent reason. We didn't stick around to ask any more questions. We never went back to that park. I don't know what happened that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the faint hum of an engine starting up, and I wonder, what would have happened if we'd stayed another night? If you thought the last story kept you on edge, the next will leave you sleepless. I've never been much of a camper. My idea of a weekend getaway usually involves a cozy cabin or a cheap hotel, anything with Wi-Fi and a good bed, really. But when my friends, Steve, Jess, and Amber convinced me to go RV camping in the mountains for the weekend, I couldn't say no. I mean, how bad could it be? We were in an RV, not a tent. It had a bathroom, a fridge, even a small TV. It wasn't exactly roughing it. We set out early on a Friday morning, packed up with food, drinks, and enough board games to last us the weekend. The drive was long, winding up a narrow mountain road, the kind where you can't see the bottom if you look over the edge. Jess was driving and Steve was navigating, while Amber and I were in the back, playing cards. It was fun at first, but the further we went, the more isolated it felt. No other cars, no houses, just trees and more trees. It was like the world was disappearing behind us. By the time we reached the campsite, it was late afternoon. The sun was dipping low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the clearing where we parked. There was no one else around, just us. It was peaceful, quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. But we shrugged it off. We were here to have fun after all. It was just us and nature. No cell phones, no internet. a real escape from everything. We set up the RV, got a fire going outside, and spent the evening grilling hot dogs and marshmallows. It was perfect, until it wasn't. Later that night, around 11 p.m., we all piled into the RV to sleep. It was colder than we expected, and the fire had burned down to embers. The RV felt cozy, though, with the soft glow of a lantern casting shadows on the walls. We were laughing, telling stories, just like any group of friends would on a camping trip. Then, Steve's phone buzzed. We all looked at each other, confused. There was no signal out here. We'd checked a dozen times on the drive up. Steve picked up his phone, his brow furrowed. "That's weird," he muttered. "What is it?" Amber asked, peeking over his shoulder. Steve held up his phone, showing us the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was short, just 3 words. "I'm right outside." We all laughed. It had to be a prank. Maybe Jess had sent it earlier when we still had signal, and it just now came through. But Jess swore it wasn't her. About an hour later, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A light tap, tap, tap on the window by my head. My eyes snapped open, my heart racing. I held my breath, listening. It came again, a soft, deliberate tap, like someone was outside, gently knocking. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, glancing at Steve, who was lying across from me. He didn't answer, but I could see his eyes were wide open, staring at the window. Amber and Jess were awake too, both sitting up, their faces pale. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was louder this time, more insistent. My stomach dropped. There was no way anyone could be out there. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles. But the tapping, it was real. It was right there, just outside the window. Steve reached for his phone again, his hand shaking. Another text had come through. "Why aren't you answering?" My blood turned to ice. Amber let out a small gasp, and Jess scrambled to the front of the RV, peering out the windshield. "There's no one out there," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the tapping continued. I wanted to move, to get up and check the windows myself, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. Then Steve's phone buzzed again. Another text. "Look out the window." My breath caught in my throat. None of us moved. We just stared at each other, our faces white as sheets. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The RV was silent again, but the air was thick with tension, like we were all waiting for something terrible to happen. Steve's phone buzzed one more time. This time, the message was longer. "I can see you. I know you're scared. Come outside and I'll stop." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, grabbing the lantern, and threw open the door of the RV. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and I stepped outside, shining the light around. Nothing. Just the dark outline of the trees and the faint glow of the moon. I walked around the RV, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. "There's no one out there," I said, but my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. We didn't sleep much after that. We just sat there, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The messages stopped. The tapping never came back. The next morning, we packed up and left as fast as we could. None of us talked about it much after that. It was like we didn't want to acknowledge what had happened, like maybe if we didn't say it out loud, it wouldn't be real. But every now and then, the fear you felt before was just a taste. Now let's dive deeper into the unknown. I've always loved the peace and quiet of the great outdoors. My wife Emily and I had taken up RV camping about a year ago, and since then, it had become our favorite way to get away from it all. There's something incredibly calming about parking your home on wheels in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise of city life. We weren't exactly the rugged outdoorsy types, but with our RV, we had the best of both worlds, comfort and nature. Last summer, we decided to try a new campground. It was deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from our home. A friend had recommended it, saying it was the perfect spot for some real peace and quiet. No crowds, no noise, just you and nature, he'd said. And that's exactly what we were looking for. The place was remote, more remote than we expected. The road was bumpy and narrow, with towering trees on either side. We passed only a couple of other cars along the way, which seemed odd, but I figured it was just because the place was off the beaten path. After all, that was part of the appeal. We arrived late in the afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows through the trees. The campground was small, just a few spots for RVs, and only one other camper was parked at the far end. It was an older couple, sitting in lawn chairs and sipping something out of mugs, enjoying the quiet. They gave us a friendly wave as we pulled into our spot. It was perfect. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. Emily and I set up camp, making sure everything was in place before the sun set. We had a fire pit, a little picnic table, and enough space to stretch out and relax. As the day turned to dusk, we lit a small fire and sat together, just enjoying the stillness. There was something about being surrounded by trees that made the world feel far away. Emily had her Kindle out, reading by the light of the fire, while I stared up at the sky, watching the stars slowly appear. That's when I noticed it for the first time. Out of the corner of my eye, something caught my attention. A glimmer in the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I turned my head, squinting into the darkness, but saw nothing unusual. Just the forest? Thick and quiet. I shrugged it off. Probably just a reflection of something, I told myself. Emily didn't seem to notice, and I didn't want to make a big deal of it. We were in the woods, after all. Animals, reflections, and shadows were normal. But then, about half an hour later, I saw it again. This time, I was sure. A pair of small, glowing eyes watching us from the trees. "Hey, Em," I said, nudging her gently. "Do you see that?" She looked up from her book, following my gaze. "See what?" Emily squinted, then shook her head. "I don't see anything. Probably just a raccoon or something, right?" "Yeah, maybe," I said, but I wasn't convinced. The eyes hadn't moved. They just hovered there, watching. A little while later, we decided to call it a night. We put out the fire and climbed into the RV, locking the doors behind us. I didn't mention the eyes again, but they were still on my mind as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. We were out in the middle of nowhere, sure, but we were safe inside the RV, right? The next morning, everything seemed normal. We made breakfast, took a short hike through the woods, and spent the day lounging around the campground. I'd almost forgotten about the eyes from the night before, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, though, as soon as the sun went down, they were back. This time, there were more of them. At first, it was just one pair again, far off in the trees. Then another appeared, a little closer, and another, all glowing softly in the dark just beyond the range of our fire. "Okay, that's weird," Emily finally admitted when she saw them too. "Those definitely aren't raccoons." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "No, they're not." We both stared at the eyes for a while, neither of us saying anything. There had to be some explanation, right? Some kind of animal, maybe deer? But the way the eyes just hovered there, unblinking, sent a chill down my spine. "Let's go inside," Emily said quietly. We put out the fire and retreated to the safety of the RV. I tried not to look out the windows, but curiosity got the better of me. I peeked through the blinds, hoping the eyes would be gone. They weren't. Now there were at least 6 pairs, all scattered throughout the trees, all fixed on our RV. "Do you think we should leave?" Emily asked, her voice shaking slightly. I nodded, grabbing the keys from the counter. "Yeah, let's get out of here." I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. I tried again, but the engine wouldn't start. "Are you kidding me?" I muttered, my heart racing. The RV had never had any issues before. I tried again and again, but the engine was dead. Emily was pacing nervously, glancing out the windows. "Those eyes, they're getting closer," she whispered. I looked out again. She was right. The eyes were inching closer to the RV, like whatever was watching us was slowly creeping forward, gaining confidence. I kept trying the engine, but no luck. It was as if something didn't want us to leave. That night was the longest of my life. We stayed locked inside the RV, listening to every creak and rustle from outside. The eyes never moved away, but they didn't come any closer either. They just watched. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a faint scratching sound. It was soft at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder. Emily sat up, wide-eyed. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, feeling my stomach drop. The scratching grew more frantic, like something was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window, but there was nothing there. Just those glowing eyes, watching. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, the eyes were gone, and the RV started without a problem. We didn't waste any time. We packed up and left as fast as we could. To this day, I don't know what those eyes were, or why they were watching us. We never went back to that campground, and I don't think we ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the lights are off, I swear I can still feel them, those eyes, watching from the shadows.